Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and today we're continuing with my Kamigawa Neon Dynasty set review. So far, we've looked at all the cards in the set that aren't mono green, so today we're wrapping up the card by card portion of the review with a look at all the green cards. In these videos, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on every card. If you aren't sure what the meaning of those grades are, you can find an explanation in the description. Keep in mind this video contains my thoughts about the cards in this format before actually playing with the format. I will undoubtedly get some things wrong, but as the format evolves, I'll talk about those things on the channel. Also, keep in mind we're only talking about limited here, not any other formats. Alright, let's take a look at our first green card in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. First up, we've got Azusas Mini Journeys, which for one generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says you may play an additional land this turn. Chapter 2 says you gain 3 life. Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. All of the sagas in this set turn into enchantment creatures at Chapter 3, or I guess the last chapter anyway. Some of them might have more than 3 chapters. But anyway, it becomes Likeness of the Seeker, which is a 3/3 enchantment creature human monk. And when it becomes blocked, you untap up to 3 lands you control. This is an interesting card because how good it is varies widely depending on the time of game it is. In the late game, it's not very good. You probably won't be able to play an extra land. You just don't have them at that point in the game. And gaining 3 life, while it helps, isn't great. And the creature you get at the end, also not that impressive in the late game. That said, in the early game, this has a decent shot at ramping you and then giving you a nice creature for the board a couple of turns later. Basically, if you play it on turn 2, it's going to feel like a B, but if you play it later in the game, it's going to be pretty close to a D because basically all you end up getting is a 3/3 a couple of turns later. I think that means we have to give it a C. Next up, it's Bamboo Grove Archer, which for one generic and a green is a 3/3 enchantment creature, Snake Archer at common. It's got Defender and Reach, and it has Channel, which means you can pay a mana cost and discard it for an effect. In this case, you can pay 4 generic and a green to destroy target creature with flying. If you're in the market for a defensive creature, this is a pretty good one. A 2-mana 3/3 with Reach will slow the board to a grinding halt in the early game, and the fact that you can use this as Plummet sometimes is nice upside. It isn't exactly the kind of card all decks want, but grindier green decks will probably be happy to play a few of these, while aggro decks probably aren't playing it at all. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Bearer of Memory, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 enchantment creature human monk at common. For 5 generic and a green, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target enchantment creature, and it gains trample until end of turn. There was a time when a 3-mana 3/2 with upside would just always be a playable card, but as the quality of cards continues to increase, or at least the average quality of cards, cards like this are really getting left behind because this just isn't good enough compared to most of the cards in this set. It's mostly a 3-mana 3/2, and its ability is just way too expensive. You know, it's an enchantment payoff and stuff, but the ability is just way too highly costed for this to really be something that'll make the cut in your deck most of the time, which again is weird. Like 3 years ago, this probably would have been a C, but right now, this feels like a D+. Blossom Prancer is next, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 spirit at uncommon. It's got Reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or enchantment card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you didn't put a card into your hand this way, you gain 4 life. This is a very good uncommon. Your decks will have enough enchantments and creatures in it that you will virtually always hit with the ability, so you're ending up with a 5-mana 4/4 with Reach that draws you a very real card. It's nice that if you do miss, or you're in a situation where you'd rather have 4 life, you can do that too. And yeah, a 5-mana 4/4 Reach that gains you 4 life as an Enter the Battlefield ability would also be a pretty nice card, and this sort of gives you a choice between those two things. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Boon of Bosuju, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the greatest mana value among permanents you control. Untap it. This looks like a solid trick. It will often give a significant buff for the cost, and untapping your attacking creature sometimes matters too, since it enables it to hang back and block. The untap part also means you can try to use it to ambush an opposing attacker, but that's generally a riskier way to use this sort of thing, since your opponent is more likely to have mana up. I went pretty deep on tricks in one of my Needs and Notes videos if you want to hear more about that, but suffice it to say, you want to use this on an attacker like 90% of the time, especially because it has the upside of lethal out of nowhere. It is still a trick and a conditional one, but I think an aggressive deck will be happy with a couple of these. I'm giving it a C. Next, we have Bosuju reaches Skyward, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says, search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. Chapter 2 says, put up to 1 target land card from your graveyard on top of your library. And Chapter 3 says, exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control, and it becomes Branch of Bosuju, a 0/0 enchantment creature plant with reach, and it gets +1/+1 for each land you control. I'm always a little concerned about a 4-mana card that doesn't immediately add to the board in any way, and that's certainly what we have going on here. Searching up a couple of forests will be nice, but it isn't that impactful in the immediate future. There are going to be times where Chapter 2 isn't even something you want to do because you'd rather draw something that isn't a land. Ultimately, though, this will add to the board, and usually with quite the formidable creature. But with like a lot of these, it taking a couple of turns can be a bit brutal in games where you need something that does something more immediately. Still, if you're able to draw the 2 lands and then transform this a couple of turns later, it will be a real presence on the board. I think this is a B-. Next up, we've got Careful Cultivation, which for 2 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura. It says enchant artifact or creature, and as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+3 and has reach, and it can tap for 2 green mana. And it has Channel for 1 generic and a green, discard it, create a 1/1 green human creature monk token with tap, add green mana. In a lot of formats, a 2-mana 1/1 that can tap for green mana is very playable, and this is better than that in a lot of ways since you can stick it out there at instant speed with Channel. Meanwhile, the Aura side of things does a pretty good job of ramping you too, and offers a solid stats boost. I do feel like you're going to be more interested in channeling this most of the time, as that's the best deal you can get here. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Coiling Stalker, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/1 Snake Ninja at common. It's got Ninjutsu for 1 generic and a green. This is a returning mechanic where you can return an unblocked attacker you control to your hand, and then you put this card, the one with Ninjutsu, onto the battlefield from your hand tapped and attacking. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control that doesn't have a +1/+1 counter on it. If you Ninjutsu this in, you end up paying 2 for a 2/1 that puts a counter somewhere. Note, by the way, that somewhere can be on itself too. Now, you obviously also return the thing to your hand so it isn't all upside, but still, this is a pretty good deal. And it's the kind of creature that is a pretty real problem if your opponent can't get blocks in front of it. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Commune with Spirits, which for 1 green is a common sorcery, and it says look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an enchantment or land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is cheap and gives you some decent card selection, but it also doesn't really do a whole lot, and cards like that seem to be getting worse and worse and limited these days. It being restricted only to enchantments and lands is kind of a bummer too, even though in green you're likely to have a lot of those, but I just think you usually don't play this. I'm giving it a D. Next up, we have the Dragon Commie Reborn, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 say, you gain 2 life, look at the top 3 cards of your library, exile one of them face down with a hatching counter on it, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Chapter 3 says, exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed, and it becomes Dragon Commie's Egg, an enchantment creature egg that's a 0/1, and when it, or a dragon you control, dies, you may put a creature from among cards you own in exile with hatching counters on them without paying its mana cost, and that is, cast a creature spell from among cards you own in exile with hatching counters on them without paying its mana cost. This seems pretty awkward. Chapter 1 and 2 won't do much right away, though gaining life does help soften that blow. And then, once it transforms, you're reliant on making dragons, or the egg needs to die to get the rest of the card to do its thing. Now, if you can make that happen, it will feel pretty good. But if your plan is just to have the egg die, keep in mind you're not really netting a card in the end. Instead, you're just getting a discount. And since you get to have 2 things with the hatching counters, you're decently likely to have something nice to put into play. But still, ideally, you want to have the egg and some other dragon die to reap the rewards for this to actually be good, and that's just not going to be super easy. There just aren't dragons in this set at lower rarities. There is a lot of upside here, but this just won't do very much way too often. I think it's a D. Next up, we've got Fade into Antiquity, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it says exile target artifact or enchantment. There's so many artifacts and enchantments in this set that this will virtually always have a target, and it's something you'll basically always want one of in your main deck. It even kills a ton of creatures in this format. I do think it's a little too restricted to be straight up premium, but it gets kind of close. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we've got Fang of Shigeki, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 enchantment creature snake ninja at common, and it has Death Touch. 1 mana 1/1s with Death Touch are always playable, mostly because they have the ability to trade up with just about anything. This one also comes with enchantment and ninja upside, though in green, probably only the former matters. Still, you probably won't ever cut the first few copies of these from your green decks, giving it a C. Next up, it's Favor of Jukai, which for 3 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura with enchant artifact or creature, and as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +3/+3 and has reach, and you can channel it for 1 and a green, and target creature gets +3/+3 and gains reach until end of turn. Channeling this will be the better deal most of the time, as the tricks we see that offer this same boost and reach always tend to be fine, but it's nice that you can also use this as a more permanent boost in situations where that's better. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Generous Visitor, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 spirit at uncommon, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This looks like a really good 1-drop. This set has a ton of enchantments across the board, but especially in green, so you end up with a 1-drop that can add a whole lot of +1/+1 counters to the board over the course of a game. And sure, it's fragile on its own, but even if you only get a single counter out of it, you're getting pretty good value, and sometimes this will be capable of taking over games. I think this is worth a pretty high pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Geothermal Commie, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 spirit at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you may return an enchantment you control to its owner's hand, and if you do, you gain 3 life. I like commons like this. It's a fine 4 mana 4/3 in a worst case, but it comes with an effect that can be pretty sweet in some situations. Returning something like a Saga you want to go back to Chapter 1 on, or an Aura you wanted to move anyway, will be particularly nice, and the 3 life that's tacked on is fine too. This is a solid playable, giving it a C. Next up, we have Goshintai of Boundless Vigor, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 legendary enchantment creature shrine at uncommon. It's got trample, and at the beginning of your end step, you may pay 1 generic mana. When you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on target shrine for each shrine you control. Like most of these, this is pretty good on its own, where it would be a 2 mana 1/1 trampler that you can put a counter on every end step for 1 mana. That's certainly a quality card. Even without other shrines, I don't imagine you'll ever cut this from your green decks. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Grafted Growth, which for 2 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura with enchant land, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control, and enchanted land can tap for 2 mana of any color. We've seen similar cards before, and the fact that they fix and ramp for you while adding a little something to the board always makes them pretty reasonable, especially if you're in the market for mana of any color. You probably don't play it in a 2-color deck, though. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we've got Greater Tanuki, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 enchantment creature dog at common. It has trample, and you can channel it for 2 generic and a green, and search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This seems pretty nice. In the early game, you can use it to fix and ramp your mana, and in the late game, it can be a big beater that helps you close things out. It isn't super incredible at doing either thing, but effectively being a split card with a worse rampant growth on one side and a worse Colossal Dreadmaw on the other gives you a decent option all game long, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Harmonious Emergence, which for 3 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura with enchant land you control. Enchanted land is a 4/5 green spirit creature with vigilance and haste. It's still a land. If enchanted land would be destroyed, instead sacrifice Harmonious Emergence, and that land gains indestructible until end of turn. There's a red card like this too, and I didn't love it, and I don't love this either. Animating a land is always less powerful than it seems, and even adding the indestructible angle here isn't that exciting. It does give you a reasonably efficient creature, but it's also one that effectively makes you give up mana if you want to be using it. I do think it's a little better than the red one, because this one is going to be more formidable in the later stage of the game, and it has vigilance, allowing you to use its mana more easily, and it's nice there's such a pain in combat thanks to indestructibility. I think this is probably a C-. Next up, it's Heir of the Ancient Fang, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 snake samurai at common, and it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if you control a modified creature. Modified is a new keyword in this set, and something is modified if it has an equipment, an aura you control, or any kind of counters on it. This is a 3 mana 2/3 that will sometimes be a 3 mana 3/4, and there will be curve outs where you play a modified thing on turn 1 or 2 and then this, and that's going to feel pretty good, but it'll still be a 3 mana 2/3 a little too often. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Historian's Wisdom, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant artifact or creature, and when it enters the battlefield, if enchanted permanent is a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield, draw a card, and as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +2/+1. This is an aura I can actually get behind playing in Limited, and no, not because I'm a historian. I'm willing to play this because it will replace itself pretty often, as +2 power on your biggest creature has a pretty decent shot at drawing you a card. That means you are no longer in danger of getting 2 for 1 like you would be with a typical aura. Now, it is still a little tricky to use, you have to be careful not to get blown out the turn you cast it, and it isn't game breaking or anything, but it seems perfectly solid. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Invoke the Ancients, which for 1 generic and 4 green is a rare sorcery, and it creates 2 4/5 green spirit creature tokens, and for each of them, you put your choice of a vigilance counter, a reach counter, or a trample counter on it. Like the rest of this cycle, this is a bit hard to cast in Limited, but it does something quite powerful, and actually, green will have an easier time being able to cast its Invoke spell because it has better access to fixing. 5 mana for 2 4/5s, each of which has 1 keyword ability, is an amazing deal. If it were easy to cast, it would probably be an A-, but the challenge of casting this is real enough that I think it's probably held to a B. Next up, it's Jukai Defends the Temple, which for 2 generic and a green is a mythic rare enchantment saga. Its Chapter 1 says, create a 1/1 green human monk creature token with tap, add green mana. Chapter 2 says, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. And Chapter 3 says, exile this and transform it. And it comes back as Remnant of the Rising Star, which is a 2/2 enchantment creature dragon spirit with flying. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay X. When you do, put X +1/+1 counters on that creature. And as long as you control 5 or more modified creatures, Remnant of the Rising Star gets +5/+5 and has trample. This looks really good. It gives you something that affects the board up front, which is great, and it even ramps your mana. Then Chapter 2 will buff a couple of creatures, which will also, of course, modify them. And when you get to Chapter 3, you end up with a very impressive creature who can buff any creature you play, and it even threatens to get bigger if you have enough modified creatures, which there's a decent chance you will because he helps you do it. This feels like a bomb to me. Even waiting a couple of turns to get Jukai in the late game is no big deal, because you're getting 2 other very real chapters before you get there. It's also great that Jukai is a very relevant creature all game long. I'm giving this an A. Next up, it's Jukai Preserver, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/3 enchantment creature human druid at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and you can channel it for 2 generic and a green, and you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures you control. At worst, this is a 4 mana 4/4, and it's much better than that because it allows you to put counters wherever you want. The channel part of the card is nice too because sometimes utilizing this more like a trick or spreading around the modifications is just better anyway. It slots nicely into the red-green modification deck as well as green-white enchantments. I think you can take this with a first pick in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Jukai Trainee, which is 1 generic and a green for a 2/2 human samurai at common, and when it blocks or becomes blocked, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So they decided to give this the old samurai Bushido mechanic. It's basically a 2 mana 2/2 that's harder than most 2 mana 2/2s to block or attack through, and that's probably enough of an upside for you to play this as a 2-drop in a decent chunk of your decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Commie of Transients, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 spirit. At rare, it's got trample. And whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Commie of Transients. And at the beginning of each end step, if an enchantment was put into your graveyard from the battlefield this turn, you may return Commie of Transients from your graveyard to your hand. This is a great bear. It'll get bigger throughout the game, and it can return from your graveyard if an enchantment goes to the graveyard, and that's going to happen a lot in a format with lots of enchantment creatures. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, we've got Kappa Tech Wrecker, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 turtle ninja at uncommon, and it has ninjutsu for 1 generic and a green. It enters the battlefield with a death touch counter on it, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may remove a death touch counter from it, and when you do, you exile target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So they really did it. This is a ninja turtle. Anyway, a 2 mana 1/3 with death touch is always playable. Being able to trade for everything is a huge deal, and this comes with ninjutsu and the ability to naturalize something when it hits the opponent, and there's plenty of stuff to blow up with that in this format. It's also pretty nice in the red-green deck, which is about modifications, because it's one of the few 2-drops that enters the battlefield already modified because it has a counter. I think this is a B. Next up, we've got Kodama of the West Tree, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 legendary creature spirit at Mythic Rare. It's got reach, and modified creatures you control have trample. And whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So this is a 3 mana 3/3 with a text box loaded with upside, and it's hard to go wrong there. Even if it was just a 3 mana 3/3 with reach, it would probably be at least a C+, but giving modified creatures trample and letting you search up basic lands is pretty nice. Obviously, you're going to need to do some modifying to take full advantage of this, but that's not a huge ask for green in this set as we've seen throughout this video. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Kura, the Boundless Sky, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 legendary creature dragon spirit at Mythic Rare. It's got flying and death touch, and when it dies, you have 2 choices. One of them is that you can search your library for up to 3 land cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. And the other is you can create an XX green spirit creature token where X is the number of lands you control. We've seen the rest of this cycle throughout the week, and they have all graded as bombs, and that's not changing here. Although I do think Kura got the worst stat line of the bunch, but that's only compared to some completely absurd stat lines. A 5 mana 4/4 with flying and death touch is obviously a great rate and can end the game on its own. And then if your opponent ever kills Kura, you're going to make some sweet value happen. It will probably make the most sense to make the creature token, as this gives you an immediate board presence that will also be a headache for your opponent. Basically, you're paying 5 mana for a 4/4 with flying and death touch and a 5/5 at that point, at least a 5/5, and the token can just get bigger. The land ability is something you'll only do on really rare occasions in Limited where maybe getting the right lands lets you cast another bomb or something. So it does have the worst stat line of the group, but leaving behind a huge token when it dies is still enough for it to be an A+. Next up, it's March of Burgeoning Life, which for X and a green is a rare instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you may exile any number of green cards from your hand. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. Choose target creature with mana value less than X. Search your library for a creature card with the same name as that creature, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. The other marches are all pretty good and limited. This one, not so much, for obvious reasons. Having the duplicates of creatures that makes this worth using is just very unlikely. And it isn't even like it does a whole lot when you do, as you're just tutoring a very specific creature into play, and usually paying 1 more mana than the card costs. This is an F. Next up, we've got Master's Rebuke, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. We see versions of this card all the time, and it always ends up being green premium removal. It allows you to kill a lot of things pretty efficiently, and having a large enough green creature in play to make it work isn't that hard. You do have to be a little careful with when you use it, because if they blow up your creature in response, it is some really terrible news. But if you pick your spots, this is nice. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Orochi Merge Keeper, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 Snake Druid at uncommon. You can tap it for green mana, and as long as Orochi Merge Keeper is modified, it has tap, add 2 green mana. So this can accelerate your mana, and when it gets modified, it can do it even more quickly. Being able to play your 4 mana cards a turn earlier than your opponent is pretty nice. Mana dorks do, of course, have the downside of being pretty mediocre in the later part of the game, but the upside they give you early tends to make them good enough. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Roaring Earth, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon enchantment, and it says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control, and it has Channel for X and 2 green, and you put X +1/+1 counters on target land you control, it becomes a 0/0 green spirit creature with haste. It's still a land. So this is a crazy strong uncommon. This will spit out +1/+1 counters all game long, making your board increasingly problematic for your opponent. Adding Channel to the mix is a pretty serious upgrade too, because drawing this in the late game wouldn't be all that impressive, because you just don't have that many more lands coming into play. But if you get it late, you can just channel it to make one of your lands into a creature, something that is far more impactful in situations where you don't get this until late. This is worth taking pretty highly and is probably the best uncommon in the set. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Season of Renewal, which for 2 generic and a green is a common instant. And it says choose one or both. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or return target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. So you need to be getting both a creature and an enchantment back when you use this, or you aren't going to be getting enough for your investment. While enchantments are pretty plentiful in this set, especially in green, I do think this needs a build around, because if you have fewer than like 5 enchantments, this probably isn't worth it. It's probably like a D, and if you get enough enchantments for this to get 2 things back, it's probably a C. One cool thing you can do with it is get back cards with Channel and, actually cast them this time, or maybe channel them again. Next up, it's Shigeki Jukai Visionary, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 legendary enchantment creature Snake Druid at rare. You can pay 1 generic and a green and tap it and return it to your hand to reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield, tapped, put the rest in your graveyard, and he has Channel for 2x and 2 green, and you discard him and you return X target non-legendary cards from your graveyard to your hand. This is another channel card with a cool design. In the early game, you can use it to help you ramp your mana, and then once you've ramped your mana enough, you have a pretty nice channel effect that will allow you to get back a whole bunch of permanents, and you will have milled some permanents because of Shigeki's ability. And of course, because Shigeki comes back to your hand, you can decide whether you want to channel it pretty much every time it comes back. And channeling it in the late game is the kind of thing that will often just get you there. And because it's so useful in the early game too, I'm pretty happy with this overall. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Spinning Wheel Kick, which for 2x and 2 green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each of X target creatures and or planeswalkers. This is a neat take on this type of green removal. It has a higher ceiling than most cards like it, but it also has a pretty disappointing floor. You have to pay 4 mana to do the damage to one thing, and at sorcery speed. That's something we've gotten pretty regularly for about 3 mana of late, and at instant speed. It not being an instant matters for sure too, because with this type of spell you have to pick your spots carefully, as a removal spell will utterly blow you out. And if something's an instant, it's easier to find an opening, so the floor here isn't great. However, if you pay 6 for this and it lets you take down 2 creatures, you're going to feel awesome. And in the extreme late game, it can do even more work than that. I don't think it's quite premium removal just because the baseline is so mediocre. And the requirement that a card like this already asks of you, that is, having a creature with high power and your opponent not being able to interact with you, are big enough hurdles in addition to this not being that efficient when you only pay 4 for it, that I think this is just a C+. Next up, we have Springleaf Avenger, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 insect ninja. At rare, it's got ninjutsu for 3 generic and a green, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Getting a permanent back when you hit a player is great, and ninjutsu helps make it pretty likely you'll get to do that at least once. On top of that, this creature is actually large enough that even on later turns it presents a problem anytime it attacks. I'm giving it an A-. I think it's a bomb. Next up, we've got Story Weave, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. It says choose one. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, or put 2 lore counters on target saga you control. The next time one or more enchantment creatures enters the battlefield under your control this turn, each enters with 2 additional +1/+1 counters on it. This has a really neat design. The +1/+1 counter part of it can be a passable combat trick, although the more powerful option is assuredly the one where you accelerate your saga and make the creature that comes into play from it larger. For pretty much every saga in the set, this will immediately make it into a creature with those 2 extra counters, and doing it at instant speed can let you really wreck your opponent. Now, that use won't always be possible, and as always, we have to look at what this card will do on average, and sometimes it's just going to be a mediocre combat trick. But I think it will do something nice with one of these modes often enough that it seems like it's at least a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. If you find yourself really able to turn sagas into creatures, bigger creatures than they would have been otherwise on a more consistent basis, it'll definitely go up. Next up, it's Tales of Master Sashiro, which for 4 generic and a green is a common enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 say put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control. It gains vigilance until end of turn. And Chapter 3, of course, says exile this and transform it. It comes back as Sashiro's living legacy of 5/5 enchantment creature Snake Warrior with vigilance and haste. This looks quite good to me, especially for a common. Chapter 1 and 2 actually give a fairly significant buff. +1/+1 counter and vigilance for a turn is pretty sweet, because it may not only enable a better attack, it allows you to alter how a race is going because of vigilance. Now, sometimes paying 5 for Chapter 1 is going to feel rough, like if getting the counter and vigilance doesn't do much for you, but at the stage in the game that you play this, it is pretty likely to be useful. Then you end up with a pretty nice creature with haste and vigilance, which of course means it can swing right away, unlike most of these saga creatures. I think this might be Green's best common. It's at least in the conversation. It gives you a ton of very real value up front, and then a pretty nice creature. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Tamiyo's Safekeeping, which for 1 green mana is a common instant, and it says target permanent you control gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. You gain 2 life. I'm never a big fan of this type of card. It can save your creatures from a lot of stuff, but the fact that it doesn't buff the creature at all means that when it comes to combat, this isn't necessarily going to do enough to be worth using, since your creature is less likely to be able to kill an opposing creature. It already has to be big enough. So, this is the most useful at countering a removal spell, which is a nice effect, but it's narrow enough that I don't love running this kind of card. If you have some impressive bombs that you really need to protect, maybe it gets a little better, but I think it's a D+. Next up, it's Teachings of the Kirin, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says, mill 3 cards and create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. Chapter 2 says, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. And Chapter 3 says, exile this and transform it. And it comes back as Kirin Touched Orochi, a 1/1 enchantment creature snake monk. And when it attacks, choose one. Exile target creature card from a graveyard. When you do, create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. Or exile target non-creature card from a graveyard. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This looks pretty good. It's another saga that adds something to the board immediately, and that's nice. Then you get a +1/+1 counter, which is also a pretty nice thing to have, and once it transforms, it can attack and gobble up cards in graveyards for value. And because it milled you 3 cards, it will have a good shot at being able to do one of the things that it can do. Now, a 1/1 that becomes a 2/2 won't always be incredible by the time this comes into play as a creature, and that does hold the card back. But I think it gives you enough value overall to be a B. Next up, we've got Weaver of Harmony, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 enchantment creature snake druid at rare. Other enchantment creatures you control get +1/+1, and you can pay 1 green and tap it to copy target activated ability or triggered ability you control from an enchantment source. You may choose new targets for the copy. An enchantment creature lord looks to be pretty formidable in this format, and the fact that this can copy enchantment abilities is pretty sweet in a set with sagas. Now, you can end up with 2 copies of the enchantment creature a saga gives you, since they are on double-face cards and not tokens, but you can copy other chapters and do some other wacky things with enchantments in this set. I think this is a B. And our last green card is Web Spinner Cuff, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/4 artifact creature equipment spider. At uncommon, it's got reach. An equipped creature gets +1/+4 and has reach, and it has reconfigure for 4. So the usual 3 mana 1/4 reach spider we get is like a C-. They aren't great, but you end up playing them in grindier green decks. They don't have a good way to stop flyers. Adding the additional reconfigure upside here is nice, especially because green cares a lot about creatures being modified. I think this is a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Well, those are my thoughts on all the green cards in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and that also brings us to the end of the color-by-color limited review of this set. I'm not done getting you ready for the new format though. Tomorrow, this format's archetype guide will come out, where I'll talk about each of the color pairs and what their internal synergies are. If you disagreed with anything in this video, let me know in the comments. If you want to make sure you catch even more limited content, as well as a bunch of Magic content in general, you should subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you're caught up on this set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.